LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of child abuse and violent crime. Please listen with care. How do young people become radicalised? Is it nature or nurture? Or something far more complex? Dr. John Kasinathan is a forensic psychiatrist who specialises in the treatment of children and adolescents. In this episode, hear about the science of the developing brain, the realities of being an incarcerated child in Australia, and one of the most shocking acts imaginable: a child killing their entire family. My name's Catherine Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author, and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world.
Adolescent offenders are quite different to adult offenders. So we know that the part of the brain to develop latest or last is the frontal lobes or the prefrontal cortex in the brain. And we know that that fully matures by age 28. So young people have developing frontal cortices or the front parts of their brain. And that part of the brain is involved in weighing up things and seeing whether something is beneficial, so risk-benefit analysis. All the things as parents that we might try to instill in our teenagers are actually the things that are solidified or codified in their frontal cortices. So weighing up short-term effort for longer-term reward sits in the frontal lobe. Delayed gratification, excellent, you know the terms. Weighing up whether this is a sensible thing for me and my family and my peer group, that sits in the frontal lobes.
Consequences of my actions.
Managing these big feelings that I have sits in the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobes. And we know the research is very clear that young people and adolescents interacting with the justice system have high rates of childhood adversity, including directly experiencing childhood abuse. They also often come from broken families. They also come from a lot of prejudicial upbringing in terms of low socioeconomic status and other contributors. And so we're talking about young people whose childhood development hasn't been smooth or easy. So they come with that kind of contributing effects to their brain development. And so their frontal lobe development is sometimes less developed than their peers because of their childhood adversity. And when young people don't know how to manage these big feelings that they have, they sometimes turn to the things that are around them. So that could be drugs and alcohol, so substance use. And we know that substance use, the research is really clear, that has impacts on brain development and slows down maturation of the frontal lobes and ability for them to engage those neuronal processes that are really codified from what we would say is good parenting. So these young people interacting with the justice system actually come with a lot of disadvantages, and that is seen in terms of their brain development. It is also seen because we know that these same impacts increase the rate of mental illness and mental disorders in adolescents. And so research is really clear that adolescents interacting with the criminal justice system have really high rates of disorders that we see in the general community as being prevalent. So for instance, major depressive disorder, it's present in males at a rate of about 10 to 15%. It's a bit higher in females who are young offenders. We know that rates of psychosis, so that's a serious mental illness that is characterised by hallucinations. So we know that that prevalence in the community for young people sits at around 0.5%. We know that in really good studies that have looked at that in young people in the justice system, the rate of psychosis or schizophrenia spectrum disorders sits at 5%. So that is a tenfold increase. So I'm not saying every young offender has a mental illness, but I'm saying they have higher rates of mental illness. And that is really important to bear in mind when we look at adolescent offending versus adult offending, which is why, government approaches to try and make young offenders accountable as adults or treat them as adults. That process doesn't really have solid evidence base from a medical and psychiatric point of view, because you're dealing with different brains, you're dealing with different vulnerabilities, and you're dealing with young people that have high rates of mental illness.
Well, paediatrics is such a different specialty from adult medicine.
That's right.
And that's why it's treated differently. And what I find really interesting is that failure to thrive is something incredibly serious that paediatricians watch out for. Failure to thrive is things like failure to grow, inappropriate social responses, but definitely failure to grow. And so a non-nurturing environment, or an abusive or emotionally abusive, basically lack of nurturing, can affect the growth. And it's so common. And so that's one of the warning signs. And yet once children get over that, where we map their growth curve.
I think that stops generally around about the age of 3 years, isn't it? Where people stop looking at the growth charts. We should really continue looking at the growth charts. And you've highlighted something really important there, is that parents are aware that this growth and development is crucial in the first 3 years of life, which it absolutely is. But kids are still growing. They're still developing. And so if there's adversity or untreated mental illness, that's going to have an impact on their brain development, and particularly on the centres that are involved in mood regulation and navigating life and learning from past mistakes. And maturity.
What amazes me is, evolutionary-wise, it's a bad thing that our particularly male frontal lobes, take so long to develop, because in terms of survival, this is one of the reasons that they're not good at managing risks, predicting outcomes and thinking, well, this may not end well.
Well, from an evolutionary perspective, the survival aspect is really driven by the emotional brain, which is the limbic system structures. The limbic system is actually the thing that gives the fright response and the flight response. So from an evolutionary perspective, a person will run away from a tiger if the person, even if they have underdeveloped frontal lobes. But where the frontal lobes come into play is if the brain is constantly scared about things, even things that are not a tiger, things that are benign stimulus, creating anxiety and fright. That's when the frontal lobes come into play, which is really, that's why cognitive behavioural therapy as a psychological therapy works for anxiety disorders, because it is training the frontal lobes to manage this big emotion that's coming out of their limbic system, which are the deeper structures of the brain. So evolutionary actually does make sense, because you want kids to run away from scary stuff.
Some kids are risk averse from the day they come out of the womb. Others are risk takers and can't seem to manage the concept that I could get killed doing this.
Yeah.
And so if there's no fear, that's equally scary, because they may play in the traffic. They may become violent or start a fight that ends up being incredibly violent without understanding the repercussions of those actions.
And look, that's borne out by broader statistics that look at what causes death in young people. So it's often said that, motor vehicle accidents are the leading cause of death in youth, and that it is one of the top three. But actually, the thing that beats motor vehicle accidents year on year for young people in Australia, New Zealand, UK, Europe, Asia, is actually suicide. So suicide is the leading cause of death for young people in Australia. And that goes all the way up to age 40. But those are the leading causes of the death. It's suicide is number one, motor vehicle accident is number two, and accidental drug overdose is number three. So when you look at frontal lobe development, you're right. The underdevelopment of the frontal lobe, or the lag in its development, is probably one of the drivers to those leading causes of death for young people. But the thing that's sometimes missed is that having untreated or poorly treated mental illness is a big contributor.
What sort of offences are we talking about at the moment?
So the most for young people, the most common offending would be what's called justice or property offences. So things such as stealing, theft, break-and-enters, those would be probably the most common ones. What's been rising in the last decade has been domestic violence type offences towards family members. And so police come and they put an AVO on protecting the other family member. And then if that's breached, that becomes a criminal offence. Interestingly, homicide by adolescents as a total prevalence has decreased compared to, say, 2 decades ago. So people that are alarmist and saying, young people are killing more people now than ever, that's actually a bald-faced lie. Child homicide is a rare event anyway, but it is rarer and rarer as time goes on. Something that's arisen in the last 4 years has been the onset of terror offences, and that's in conjunction with adults being charged with terror offences as well. So young people, we know adolescents are quite impressionable. And as we mentioned before, their frontal lobes are less developed, so they're less able to weigh information. So they might listen to someone like, can I say Andrew Tate? Okay, I'll just say Andrew Tate. Yeah, so a very impressionable young person with poorly developed frontal lobes, missing adult figures in their life that can give them guidance.
And maybe missing educational opportunities along the way as well.
That's right. So there might be educational exclusion. So they might listen to this person talking on whatever media stream that Andrew Tate uses, and they will start to align with his set of ideologies and beliefs. And we know that young people are more impressionable, and so they're more vulnerable to becoming potentially radicalised. And when I say radicalised, I'm not specifically talking about Islam, although that is one, extreme Islam is one ideology that can result in violent extremism, but there are actually quite a multiple array of ideologies that can result in extremism, and that's also drawn from adult literature as well. So we know that there can be extreme far right, and then there can be extreme Islamism. There can also be extreme far left as well. So people can get radicalised on a variety of different areas and ideologies, and that's why it's very difficult to kind of assess in a broad-brushed way.
So if you have somebody who's either institutionalised because of a radicalised crime or plan, how do you find them obviously they're a patient to you in some ways when you're addressing mental illness, history and behavioural therapy. What do you note that's different about them from another crime offender, for example?
So the research on this area is very much developing, but we've got some early data coming from European studies that show that of groups that have been adolescents, particularly that have been radicalised, there are high rates, much higher than you would expect, of delusional disorders and thinking. So there was a study that showed that out of 20 adolescent young people that had been radicalised, 4 of them actually met criteria for a delusional condition. So you're looking at a rate of about 1 in 5. So to not assess young people who have been, accused of a terror offence or at risk of a terror offence, I think is unwise. And really the modern evidence base suggests that all adolescents who have been radicalised or at risk of radicalisation should have a really good mental health psychiatric assessment. And we know that people with a mental illness are more likely to be vulnerable to being, adopting an ideology and becoming radicalised anyway. So it actually raises their risk if they have a mental illness. But
and
having said that,
conspiracy theories.
Correct, yeah. But not having said that, I should clarify, not every young person with a mental illness is going to become radicalised. That's not what I'm trying to say. But there is a higher rate amongst those who do get radicalised of having a mental disorder. And that's why it's really important that they're assessed really promptly. And then if there is a mental disorder present, such as psychotic disorder, or it may not be psychotic disorder, we know that some young people with depressive conditions, because they're just so low and angry and irritable, that they then focus on a particular ideological target. And it helps kind of fuel the hatred they feel towards themselves, kind of gets funneled towards this entity or people group. And so that's why intervening early with these young people is really important. So that's why services in Australia would generally look to assess young people really promptly. And then the sensible services would also assertively look at treating any conditions that are apparent. And sometimes it may not be apparent at that time, and having a really good monitoring system, so that when I say monitoring system, I don't mean ankle monitors. I'm talking about health monitoring systems, so that if a disorder becomes apparent, it is then treated really quickly. Because that actually has probably the most evidence of reducing harm later on. So, I mean, we know that the youth justice system, some people feel that all young people that offend should be locked up. Well, the sad truth is that locking young people up, there's no evidence that locking young people up in of itself reduces their risk of offending in future. The things that do reduce their risk of offending is actually assessing for relevant conditions that might be there, mental health conditions, and treating it appropriately.
And is incarcerating adolescent offenders likely to increase the risk of reoffending?
Well, it doesn't decrease the risk of reoffending. It's also a matter of what happens during that time in detention. So my colleagues and I, and I've got colleagues around Australia that work in adolescent forensic psychiatry. What the goal is we don't make the decision about a young person coming into custody, but we use it as an opportunity to do a really good health assessment. So in New South Wales, the publicly funded health service there does a physical health assessment as well as a mental health assessment, and picks up conditions that often haven't been recognised previously, and then treats them. We make the most of what may not be a fantastic time for a young person, but we're able to offer that to them in New South Wales, and my colleagues do that broadly across Australia and New Zealand.
What about personality disorders? Is that a mitigating factor in committing crimes or not if you've got an antisocial personality disorder or a narcissistic personality disorder?
Yep. So antisocial personality disorder cannot be diagnosed in under 18s, but conduct disorder is a precursor to potentially to adult antisocial personality disorder. So conduct disorder are kids behaving badly. It's like Bart Simpson on steroids. So there used to be an attitude that conduct disorder was just like, it's just kids being naughty, they'll get over it. And then in the last 20 years, what we've suddenly realised is that conduct disorder is associated with a lot of harm, not just for other people, but for the young person and their family. And we also know that those disruptive behaviour disorders are more likely to develop other mental conditions. And so the fact that someone is presenting with conduct disorder or young people offending is not just kids being badly, but it's actually a sign that there's something going on here that we need to look at. So it used to be assumed that young people that were offending, they're just harming other people, they'll be right. But how I was mentioning, that attitude of just lock them up. So there was a really good study out of Victoria that followed young people who'd been incarcerated in a youth detention centre and then released, followed them for 12 years and compared their death rate compared to other young people in the general community. And what they found was that male young offenders were 9 times more likely to end up dead. So that's 9 times, that's 900%, not 9%, 9 times more likely to end up dead than other young people in the same age group in that cohort. Young female offenders were 40 times more likely to end up dead in 12 years. So this was a study done in Victoria by Kofi and colleagues. So they're actually epidemiologists, that group that did this. And in fact, those numbers were so startling, they went back to their original data and rechecked it because the journal wasn't sure. I think it was the British Medical Journal was asking, is this for real? And I think originally they had the females at like 30 times more likely to end up dead, and they redid it and realised, sorry, we made a mistake. It's actually 40. And what were these young people dying from within the 12 years? They were dying from suicide, motor vehicle accidents, and accidental drug overdose. So the causes of death were the same as young people generally, but the rate of dying for young offenders was 9 times for males, 40 times for females. This is the motivation for why myself and other my colleagues do our work, because what we want to do is address that.
Break the cycle.
Break the cycle. And that premature death causes so much harm, not just for the young people, but their families, society in general. And if we can divert young people away from the criminal justice system and into treatment, that actually reduces their offending. That wasn't the primary goal of that study. The primary goal of the study was to see whether they connected with community health contexts, which they did. But they also linked it to a reoffending database through New South Wales and found there was a significant reduction in reoffending for young people diverted away. And this was a health diversion. And that's probably why it worked.
So what do you think is the reason for that massive rise in women relative to males who have females who've been incarcerated. Why 40 times compared to 9 times the death rate?
There is a bit of a bias in regards to sentencing compared to males and females. So if you got a charge with the same offence that I did and we both were before the same magistrate, it's more likely for me to get a custodial sentence than you. That's just the way the world runs. I'm not doing political commentary on it. That's just what it is. And so that's why it's not like girls are all angels. You know, there's still, you know, young women who do offending and some of them might be repeat offenders, but they get given more chances. That's just a bias in the system. So consequently, for those to be incarcerated into a youth detention centre means that their risks, both of offending and other factors, social instability, mental illness, unsupported family, transient home, all of those factors are much more prevalent. And so young women who end up in custody are therefore a more select group, if you like. So their risks are at a baseline are higher. And you can actually look at that with studies that look at young females in custody compared to young males, is that the young women actually have slightly higher rates of certain conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, as one example. In terms of other rates, it's pretty similar. But because young women are this more concentrated group, if you like, when they leave custody in the years that follow, they're at a much more elevated risk because of that. So that's why their rate, and remember, their rate is compared to females in the general population, not compared to males. So it just goes to show that in general terms, young males in the general population are more at risk of dying in those years than females. And you would realise this as a general practitioner yourself. Who were the young people coming to you for treatment of mental health conditions? Was it young women or young males?
Young women were more likely to have anxiety and come forward with those sort of depression.
And they're more likely to present to their GP. They're more likely to see a psychologist. They're more likely to access treatment, whereas young males are not. So young males in the community take offending out at a higher risk compared to young females in the community. But when you bring offending in and you compare the males, young male offenders are 9 times more likely to end up dead than their male counterparts.
Given your experience, what can you tell us about what it's like for an adolescent offender in a high security hospital? Yeah,
so adolescents that require high secure forensic psychiatric care, I ran I was the consultant psychiatrist for the first high secure adolescent forensic psychiatric unit in Sydney. It was actually the first one in Australia. And so it was a privilege to be part of that team. So it's in a broader high secure hospital, and it has a unit that caters for adolescents aged from 14 up to 20, because that's the age of young people that are put into juvenile custody. And so there are up to 6 young people there. They all have their own rooms, and it's a secure facility. So everyone in there is specifically trained. They've had sort of security training, and it's all run by health professionals. So the team that looks after the young people consists of nurses, psychologists, social worker, art therapist. There's a medical officer who's a psychiatry registrar, and then there's a consultant adolescent forensic psychiatrist. So that was me being part of the team. And so a day in the life would be like the nurses have to get them all up, then they have breakfast, and then they usually have a morning group that runs with our therapists there, and that might be covering different cognitive behavioural skills. It might look at dialectical behavioural skills as well, or social skills training. We also have an individualised education program. I forgot to mention there's a teacher that's involved. Usually the young people in this unit are ones that have mental health conditions that couldn't be adequately treated in a youth justice setting. So health services in New South Wales provide in-reach into youth justice settings, so provide clinical care in youth justice settings. So we're like invited guests. So the majority of young people with mental health disorders that are in custody actually get their treatment in those custodial centres. But a very small proportion might have a very high-level disorder that can't be managed appropriately there, so they're transferred to this hospital unit.
And males and females.
It's males and females, so it's mixed gender or any gender. And so so they're groups, meals, there's recreational time. A great improvement was being able to get MP3 players on the unit because it's a high secure thing. So it was a real struggle to get that. So and the reason we had to is because previously we had these Discmans, and so we couldn't buy any replacements anymore because they stopped selling Discmans, and so we had to then argue, well, the kids need to listen to something, and we had to vet the music. I remember one time as a consultant on the unit, no one wanted to listen to this album by Cursor because it's a rap artist who swears a lot. So I had to listen to the whole album to determine whether it was appropriate for an adolescent.
Was it?
It actually was. That particular album didn't have much swearing on it, so it was fine.
So swearing is the problem, not the themes of misogyny.
Oh, sorry. It was the themes and the swearing. But for some reason, this album was a bit more vanilla than others.
How do you find the interaction among the patients?
It's really fascinating. It's one of the most rewarding areas I've worked in. I used to run a group with young people as well, and I was pulling my hair out with thinking, what on earth, what group can I run? And then finally one of my registrars suggested, why don't you read a book to them? Because, one of the earliest memories that we might have as a kid is being read to. And these young people, they all had difficult upbringings, but they still had that memory of being read to. And so I'd read a chapter out of a book to them. And then the registrar and I would take it in turns to read it to them. And they would sit. These are kids that some of them have murdered, some of them have got really serious mental illness, and some of them have come from incredibly abusive backgrounds. But they all sat and listened to me read a book out of, we read Old Man and the Sea. You might have even read The Hunger Games, which is a bit ironic, but it's a teenage book, so It kind of makes sense. And they would listen avidly and would actually tell off some of the other staff that were happening to walk past if they're making too much noise, or I would glare at them too, because I would actually tell my staff, look, these young people are listening to us read for 40 minutes. Can you please just respect that? And that was just one group that was run. But it was a great opportunity to treat young people and get them better, and also be able to link them back to their home, which was a real privilege.
Has working in the area of adolescent psychiatry influenced the way you would parent your own adolescents? It's
made me really appreciate them so much more. In adolescent forensics, you treat people that have experienced horrendous things in their life or done horrendous things. At the end of the day, they're still human and they're still kids. And that's why a lot of my colleagues and I work in this space, because we connect with the humans that have done maybe really bad things or experienced really bad things. But seeing young people like that and being able to help them makes you very grateful for, children in your own life, whether that be your own biological children or, family, extended family, and just being grateful for moments with them, and that every moment with our children can be one to develop them and foster them. And it doesn't need to be anything terribly complicated, like I was talking to you about before, doing a group reading with young people who had offended very seriously, but we're in that therapeutic milieu, just reading and being there and doing something quite simple meant a lot for them. In the same way, being present with our own children is just really important. That can just be a hug, or could be just hanging out, watching a movie, giving them time.
There's a case that I'd actually like to talk about. The case of Seth Gonzalez, who was around 18.
Mm-hmm.
And he participated in a very heinous number of crimes that involved his family.
Well, he brutally killed his family. He had his parents and his younger sister, Claudine, and their house was in Ryde. At about 4:30 in the afternoon in July 2001, he entered Claudine's bedroom where she was studying. Seth was armed with a baseball bat and with 2 kitchen knives that he'd taken from the kitchen earlier. And what the court later found out that he strangled Claudine's neck and struck her at least 6 separate blows to her head with the bat and stabbed her several times with the knives that he was carrying. And there were 5 major stab wounds to her neck and 2 major stab wounds to her chest and abdomen. And so the cause of her death, which was determined by the coroner, was combined effect of the compression of her neck and the blunt force injuries and abdominal stab wounds. Now, that happened at 4:30. Now, an hour later, his mum arrived home and he attacked her with one of those kitchen knives. And this all played out in the living room or dining room. And he inflicted several stab wounds and cuts to her face, neck, chest, abdomen. Then his dad arrived an hour later at about nearly 7 p.m. and Seth attacked him with one of the knives, multiple stab wounds to his neck, chest, back and abdomen, and one of the stab wounds penetrated his right lung, another penetrated the father's heart, and then another partially severed his spinal cord. And what the pathologist said was there were several defensive wounds that the father, Teddy, had, which suggested a significant struggle. Seth, after killing his family, disposed of all the murder weapons, including the bat he'd used on Claudine, his sister. He got rid of his shoes and clothing because they were covered in blood. He showered, changed his clothes, and at some time during the evening, he spray painted the words "F off Asians" on a wall in the house in an attempt to fool those investigating. The family were actually... they were Australian, but they were Filipino origin. So he put "F off Asians" on the wall. And what he was trying to do was make out that the family had been victims of some sort of hate crime. And what was later found out was that his clothes were found to have some of the paint used in the graffiti scrawl. So there was a lot of circumstantial evidence around this. But after the homicides, he drove to a friend's house, arriving about 8 o'clock. He and his friend, who was called Sam, who was not aware of the homicides, they went into the Sydney CBD and they went to Planet Hollywood and then to a nearby video game arcade. And later in the evening, after dropping his friend off, he returned to the home in Ryde and he called police to say he discovered the bodies of his family on his arrival and that he'd chased off the intruders. He also frantically ran into his neighbour's house and told them that his parents had been shot. So it's a horrible offence. But how he got caught was, I think, equally fascinating because it illustrates the danger of someone that just lies a lot to cover lies and then lies some more. And really, Seth, who was a young person at the time, he would have been about 18, 19, really had a tendency to lie for the sake of lying. So in the days following the homicides, he appeared on television asking for the killers to come forward, saying he wanted justice. He offered a reward of $100,000 for any information. He attracted significant sympathy from media at the time. And at the family funeral, he sang a song called "One Sweet Day." So what the police started to twig was they started to notice several inconsistencies in Seth Gonzalez's account. There was no evidence of any intruders. And so they started to think he was the perpetrator. So they were able to disprove his first alibi because they were told of sightings of his car in the family driveway at the time of the homicides. So then Seth Gonzalez came up with a second alibi claiming that he'd visited a brothel at the time of the homicides. This was then later proven to be false by the sex worker who he had claimed to be with at the time. He also tried to do all these false trails. So he fabricated an email that implicated a business rival of Teddy's. He also fabricated threatening emails and he staged an attempted burglary and abduction as well. A few days after the murder, Seth visited the family accountant and inquired about his inheritance. So during the criminal trial, it was alleged that he put a deposit on a $170,000 car, like a Lexus, telling the dealership that he'd be using his inheritance to pay for the car. He traded his parents' cars and pawned his mother's jewellery. He also told his relatives in the Philippines, that he had a brain tumour, and he asked his godmother in the Philippines for $200,000 for surgery that he needed for this alleged brain tumour. So there's a whole series of lies. So the offence happened in July 2001. June 2002, New South Wales police detectives arrested Seth Gonzalez and charged him with the 3 counts of murder and also 1 count of threatening product contamination, which I think was alleged poisoning.
Yeah, he bought these, and it was all the receipts were on his email account. These toxic beans, and he apparently looked up how to kill people and make it look like they die over a few days and there's no detectable poison type things. And his mother had been admitted to hospital with severe abdominal cramps before the murders.
Yes.
And they thought maybe she had food poisoning but didn't grow an organism. And he'd actually apparently consumed some of the beans as well, or purportedly consumed some of the beans as well. So it was bizarre. Every single aspect of this seemed bizarre, and then he was courting media attention and in this sort of grandiose style.
I think he actually told people that he was going to get a record deal out of the song that he sang at the funeral itself. But yeah, the court really his trial unfolded in May 2004, and the evidence really presented that he'd been planning the murders for several months due to his parents threatening to cut him off because of his poor university results, and also they disapproved of his girlfriend apparently. But what the court heard was that he told numerous lies, not just to family members, to his friends, and also to police regarding his whereabouts. And what the court determined was that the motive for the murders was that he was fearful that due to his poor performance at university, his parents might take away his car and withdraw other privileges that he'd been granted. And he wanted to be the sole beneficiary of his parents' property, which at that time was estimated to be worth $1.5 million, which I suppose, there's inflation since then, isn't it? It's been 20 years. So look, he was found guilty on all charges, all those 4 charges, and sentenced basically the day after his 24th birthday in 2004 to 3 concurrent life sentences without parole for the murders. And I've written down actually what Justice James said regarding this young person. He said, "I consider that the murders show features of very great heinousness." I love judges and the words they use. "And that there are no facts mitigating the objective seriousness of the murders, and hence the murders fall within the worst category of cases of murder at common law." So he is serving his sentence at, I think he was at maximum security when last it was reported in the media.
My first question is, the judge found his behaviour incredibly heinous. The cold callousness of the violent death, it almost seems delusional, someone sort of with a paranoid delusion or seeing this person's a threat, but then he laid in wait for another hour. He then killed his mother. He then stayed in the same house and they knew that the deaths were at different times because of the temperature of the bodies. 3 bodies were completely different temperatures.
Right.
And that doesn't give you a specific time of death, but it gives you a fair indication that they're not all at the same time. And so to do that is unbelievably callous. And yet he was not found to be mentally ill or delusional. So what sort of a personality? Is that a personality? Is it a mental illness? What is it?
So it's probably, look, Seth Gonzalez is presented with, and you've actually illustrated that he's presented with callousness. He lies for the sake of lying. He lies repeatedly. And he also has quite overvalued ideas of his own brilliance and success. And he had a tendency to be rather parasitic, asking, relatives for money, lying and saying sort of brain tumour. His old offences were about being parasitic. So individuals with that cluster of features, they don't have a mental illness or an illness such as schizophrenia. They have a personality style called psychopathy. And psychopathy has been around since, the beginning of time, and it's been written about in books in history. It's been known with different terms over time. So sociopathy is one that have been used historically. So it's not considered a mental illness, but it is considered a personality style. So it can be very dangerous. And of course, people that don't commit offences but have a personality style that has impersonal sexual relationships, parasitic beliefs of, amazing brilliance, which then ties into narcissism as a personality disorder. So someone can have those but not have the behavioural characteristics of psychopathy. That's what's considered white-collar psychopathy. So people that, have no empathy and can just sack 100 people at Christmas time. It's been said that people have perhaps dated one or two psychopaths in their life, and, some people would identify, impersonal relationships.
No empathy.
Yeah, no empathy, self-absorbed, parasitic. I know a guy like that. So it does exist. However, when there's a crossover with criminal offending as well, that also ties into psychopathy too, like criminal versatility, and also having multiple offending too can then cross over into the criminal aspects of psychopathy. So Seth Gonzalez demonstrates some features of psychopathy. They are not delusional in the sense of mental illness, because he otherwise was incredibly lucid with everything else. There was no real...
And functional.
And functional in a certain way, yeah.
A personality like that, how do they go incarcerated?
Interestingly, the studies on psychopathy in custody don't show markedly high rates. So the rate of psychopathy in the community is very low. It sort of sits at around 1 in 1,000. The prevalence of psychopathy in prisons sits kind of around about 1%. And that's a bit of an overestimate, I would think. So the majority of prisoners are not psychopaths, but psychopaths generally respond to external controls. So in prisons, there are a lot of external controls. So they tend to follow the program when they're in.
They don't go for top dog sort of equivalent.
They can.
Or if you've got a couple in there, do they end up being more ruthless, or are they more of a target?
Depends how they come across. If they tick everyone off, then they're going to become a target. But if they're savvy, they'll keep their head down and just follow the program. Psychopaths are notoriously non-loyal. So they're generally not very successful gang members, or they're not loyal lieutenants, because they owe no allegiance.
Once somebody with mental illness has committed a crime like that, what happens with remorse once they've discovered what they've done?
Oh, it can be really terrible for them when their mental illness is treated and they realise that they've committed an offence due to something that was a false belief or a false sensation. A lot of adolescents that commit crimes in the midst of psychosis, they're usually experiencing psychosis for the first time, and so they've never had the experience of it being treated before. So someone might get command hallucinations telling them you got to kill your mum because otherwise everyone else is going to die. But this voice that they're hearing, they've never had the experience of taking a medication and that symptom going away. So they think they believe it's real, and it's as real as the voice that you're hearing now. They hear it coming from outside their head, or it might even be from inside their head, and it is so scary for them. And so they act on it. And when they're initially caught, they still believe what they heard or what they believed at the time. But then when we treat young people with psychosis who've done that, once they start to respond, it can be a really big thing for them to realise hang on, so I killed this person that actually did care for me because of this illness that now I'm getting treatment for. That's a full-on thing.
Look, this has been just so incredibly informative. So thank you, John, so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Catherine Fox, and produced by Holly Mitchell and Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.